Now it's time for The Big Idea. This is the segment where somebody joins us in the studio and gives us their pitch on a big idea for a better Australia. And then you, the viewer, get the chance to vote on that idea by going onto Twitter, going to the Twitter handle @Sky News Australia. And at the top of the screen there, you'll see a Twitter poll and you can vote yes, no, or more work needed. Tonight, we're going to hear the pitch for the change to the law so that low-risk, non-violent offenders should be punished in home detention and community service instead of jail. Essentially, non-custodial jail terms for, or non-custodial sentences for non-violent, low-risk criminals. And this is not going to be a left-wing go easy on criminals pitch. It's actually a policy idea coming to us from the Institute of Public Affairs. And Andrew Bushnell, a research fellow with the IPA, is going to put the case. Andrew, welcome to the Sky Studios.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Well, you've got the soapbox, Andrew. Give us the pitch on why there should be a change to Australia's sentencing laws.
Well, Australia is locking up more and more people each year, and it's costing more and more money, and the results just aren't what you would probably expect for all of that expenditure. The prison population this year will hit 40,000. The incarceration rate is higher than it's ever been in the country's history. It costs $110,000 per prisoner per year, which is the fourth highest rate in the OECD, and yet 58% of prisoners have been in prison before. So we're clearly not correcting their behaviour, and it's time to try something different.
Well, we've got some policy and political experts joining us to put you through the ringer on this one, Andrew. So delighted that Labor Party, or former Labor Party Cabinet Minister, now Director of Emerson Economics and all-round economic big brain, Craig Emerson is joining us. And we're also joined by Parnell McGuinness, who is the MD of the consulting firm Thoughtbroker and also the editor of Fair Go, the Liberal Party website. Welcome, Emo. Welcome, Parnell.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Well, Parnell, we might start with you. Have you got any questions for Andrew on his big idea?
Yeah, I guess when you're talking about criminals going into at-home rehab or at-home sort of detention, where would the cut-off line be for you for what is a serious enough crime or to have somebody locked up? I mean, what would the criteria be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we use a loose metric of, we know that 46% of prisoners in prison, their most serious offence was a non-violent offence. The purpose of prison really is to isolate dangerous, violent people from the community to secure public safety. Now that said, the American reformers have used a sort of broader distinction between the people that we're mad at and the people that we're afraid of. And certainly anyone who poses a threat to the community or through their recidivism indicates that their behaviour isn't going to change, they need to be taken out of the community and put in prison. But low-risk, non-violent offenders, and we're talking here about, I guess, petty thieves, drug offenders, low-level drug offenders, property crimes, white-collar criminals. These are the types of people that you could safely remove from the prison system and punish in a different way.
Craig Emerson, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll declare a tentative position based on, but conditional on the discussion that we're about to have. I think this is a good idea that is well worth discussing. The question really is whether it can be implemented practically. In the United States, the incarceration rates are horrendously high, and there's no evidence that putting people in jails, you know, overall results in better behaviour afterwards. So that's the context. So I applaud the idea. I've got two categories of people that I'd like to put to Andrew. One is what if they are, what if they are break and enters and they break and enter during the day when people aren't there? What if they steal cars and they've been doing a fair bit of that and there's no evidence to date of them being violent? So would they fit into your criterion? And secondly, I can think of some business people under the previous Labor government. Chris Bowen criminalise cartel behaviour, and I can see some homes that if a very wealthy person who is engaged in collusion and cartel behaviour end up in jail would say, well, that's not a bad outcome. You know, you've got the wine cellar there and all the luxuries, and you just got to stay home a little bit more than otherwise and be supervised on when you do go out shopping or to the movies. So I'm not sure it'd be a real big deterrent for them.
It's a good question. So what about those people who get sentenced to home detention in their harbourside mansion, Andrew? Is that sufficient punishment?
The important thing is to be consistent across all classes of non-violent offending. White-collar crime isn't a special crime. It's a form of, usually a form of property crime, just happens to be committed within corporations. There's no reason to treat these people differently from how we would propose to treat non-violent criminals generally. And so that, to go back to the first part of the question, yes, there is a difference between breaking into someone's home when that person is there and putting the fear of God into that person, and breaking into their home when they're not there. The latter is a property crime, the former is a violent crime. That said, I mean, the second part of your question was about repeat offenders, people who repeatedly steal cars or repeatedly rob houses. And yes, recidivists have indicated through their behaviour that they're not candidates for alternative punishments. The only way the community will be safe from their punishments is by putting them in prison. But like I said, it's a very large number of people whose most serious offence is a non-violent offence, and a large subset of that group could be safely punished in the community.
Parnell, keen to hear another question from you?
Yeah, look, I would actually question, sort of following on from what Craig was saying, as to where we would draw the line between punishment and rehabilitation, because it is an interesting one, because we do use prisons as a sort of a mixture of the two, don't we? So there's that question, but I'd like to double barrel it if I may, and also just ask, you know, on the, we also know that crime and criminal people generally show themselves at a much earlier age. The Dunedin study showed that you can almost pick from a very young age those people who've grown up in very adverse circumstances who's going to become a repeat offender. And I suppose the tricky ethical question from my perspective would be, at what stage do you say this is somebody who can be rehabilitated and this is somebody who can't?
Well, I think the answer to that is that you can't know for sure, and I think it's very deterministic and reductive to say that because of someone's circumstances that person is bound to commit crime. We do know that certain factors are correlated with criminal offending, and that's because they skew people's judgment of the incentives involved in criminal offending. And I think the point here is that before we use alternative punishments and before we refine the criminal justice system, we do need a renewed focus on risk assessment. Our risk assessment in prisons and within the criminal justice system isn't as scientific or as comprehensive as it could be. And there are algorithms and proprietary software that have been developed in the United States and elsewhere that can improve the predictability of people's outcomes. But I again caution that the criminal justice system is predicated on the belief that individuals are responsible for their actions and can be held to account, and any kind of reductive attempt to look at someone's circumstances and either excuse or condemn them because of those circumstances would undermine the entire criminal justice system.
Andrew, what about the important deterrent effect that the threat or risk of a prison sentence forms? I mean, let's take white-collar crime, which is very hard to detect, costs our economy enormously, costs society enormously, but for most white-collar professionals, I would put it to you that the idea of doing a stint in the big house terrifies them beyond comprehension, and that fear is a very strong deterrent for them ever undertaking any white-collar crime. If you remove that detention from the punishment, you might see a spike in white-collar crime, just to give one example.
I think it's a bit problematic to make deterrence the focus of our punishment system for a couple of reasons. The first one is that studies have repeatedly shown that criminals respond more to the chance of being caught than they do to the severity of the punishment in prospect. And the second point is that punishing someone purely to deter other people is actually not in proportion to the harm that that person's actions have caused. You'd in effect be increasing that person's punishment because of the prospective potential yet to happen crimes of other people. It's not to say, of course, that deterrence isn't part of the punishment matrix, but it's not the determining factor.
Andrew, what about the drug dealer, heroin kingpin who's causing untold harm to the community? Under your prescription, would they escape a jail sentence?
No, not necessarily, and this is the point that
it's a non-violent crime.
But part of what I said, like I said, there's a distinction between people we're mad at, people we're afraid of, and there's an element of scale. There's an element of scale to offending, repeat offending, the amount of harm that people have caused. I mean, we have this adage in the criminal justice system that the punishment must fit the crime. I'm not saying excuse criminals, I'm not saying there shouldn't be a punishment. I'm saying let's take that seriously, let's make the punishment fit the crime, and before we incur the massive expense of putting people in prison, let's look at other ways that we can get the same retributive effect, have a better effect on rehabilitation at the same time. It's a false choice between retribution and rehabilitation, and our traditional principles of just punishment and personal responsibility are totally consistent with these reforms, and more radical reforms that tried to pin down the circumstances of the offending and excuse people based on that would be, they'd be far more radical. So we know we have these problems in the criminal justice system, so let's do a conservative reform in line with our traditional principles.
All right, probably got time for one more question from our panellists. Just a reminder, viewers at home, don't just sit there and listen to the debate. You can vote on it as well. Go onto Twitter at the handle @Sky News Australia. There's a Twitter poll there, and you can vote yes, no, or more work needed to Andrew Bushnell's idea, big idea, that non-violent, low-risk criminals should be sentenced to home detention or community service rather than a jail term. Emmo, final question from you.
Andrew, don't the courts have discretion to do this anyway?
I'm in favour of the courts having discretion. I certainly wouldn't argue for mandatory sentencing or anything of the sort. But, for example, in New South Wales, they recently abolished suspended sentences and replace them with an expanded use of intensive corrections orders that actually give judges more discretion about the types of coercion that can be used against people without putting them in prison, such as home detention, curfews and the like.
Parnell, last question.
That's a good thing, isn't it?
Okay. If the issue is just deterrence, Andrew, I beg your pardon, if the issue is just cost, why not, rather than have people stay at home, ensure that the punishment and the punishment element is still there by charging people for their incarceration?
There's no reason when we're looking at alternative punishments for it to be an either-or. You can pile these alternative punishments one on top of the other: home detention, curfews, community service, fines, restitution orders. I mean, whatever it takes to get the same retributive effect. All I'm saying is that prison doesn't always fit the crime, particularly when you look at the costs and the downstream effects.